Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to C&D's webinar, Nuclear Weapons Free Middle East. How do we get there? My name's Sophie Bolt and I'm General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. This webinar is taking place alongside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee, which is in New York. Started yesterday and it runs till the end of next week. It comes at a critical time. We're seeing an increase in the number of nuclear weapons across the world, and the threat of their being used is rising too. There are greater dangers in terms of nuclear proliferation, more countries gaining technology or technological support to make nuclear weapons. Across the Middle East, the need for a nuclear weapons-free zone has never been more urgent. Israel is the only country in the region to possess nuclear weapons. We think about 90, but probably more. It refuses to admit that it has these nuclear weapons, and it won't sign up to the NPT. So basically, its nuclear weapons are outside any international regulation or inspection regimes. Its brutal assault on Gaza continues, following its unilateral withdrawal from the ceasefire agreement in March. Tensions with Iran are still high since the countries exchanged missile strikes triggered by Israel's attack on Iran's consulate in Damascus last year. Also, we're at a time of increased pressure from the US on Iran. Talks over its nuclear program are continuing. Obviously, dialogue is very good, but these talks are backed by the threat of military attack by the US and, of course, worsening economic sanctions. So what's the significance of a nuclear weapons-free zone? Currently, there are 5 nuclear weapon-free zones recognised by the United Nations. These include Latin America and the Caribbean, the South Pacific, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as well as Central Africa and Asia. These countries all have signed agreements banning the use, development, or deployment of nuclear weapons on their territory. So basically, they're an incredibly successful form of collective security across large parts of the world, including almost the entire Southern Hemisphere. So in terms of the progress on a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, where's that at? So since 1974, it's been discussed by the UN when Egypt and Iran tabled a UN General Assembly resolution. The 2010 NPT Review Conference identified 5 steps to establishing a WMD-free zone, including convening a conference and appointing a facilitator. The UN General Assembly mandated a conference to take place in 2019, with all countries in the region invited to participate, as well as the 5 officially recognised nuclear states. China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, all attended, along with 22 states from the region, but the United States and Israel stayed away. Since then, the summits have continued on a yearly basis with non-participation from Israel. The 4th session, which again Israel did not attend, was held in November 2023, soon after the start of Israel's war on Gaza. Participating governments at that session condemned Israeli threats to use nuclear weapons on Gaza. The conference also emphasised the necessity for Israel to participate, but yet again, Israel failed to attend last year. In his opening message to the conference, Secretary General Antonio Guterres stressed that Gaza has experienced a non-stop nightmare that threatens to engulf the entire region, and stated that the goal of the Middle East zone is becoming more urgent day by day. So, with the next conference taking place in November, and with these escalating tensions and dangers in the region, what are the prospects for creating a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region, and how can we build support for it? So before I take our speakers, just to explain that people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and then the speakers will be able to take those once they've contributed. So we've got a really great panel of speakers, and I'm going to take our first speaker today, which is Ben Soffer. He's a Jewish campaigner for universal human rights, and he's also Secretary of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So we're delighted to have you with us. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Sophie. Yes, so thank you everyone for attending. As an organisation, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign is very proud to work alongside CND, both as part of the coalition opposing Israel's current war against the Palestinian people and in supporting CND's wider work for a Middle East free of nuclear weapons as an absolutely vital contribution towards building a nuclear-free world. We'll all have watched in horror as the number of men, women and children murdered as part of Israel's genocidal acts towards the Palestinian population of Gaza has started to again grow after, as Sophie referenced, Israel's decision to break the ceasefire agreement in March. That grim toll has now surpassed 52,000 dead, with a third of this total being made up of children. Israel's decision to impose a complete blockade on Gaza in early March makes a complete mockery of Western demands for a surge in aid, and something that the UK and European powers have simply accepted with nothing more than letters of protest. And then if we look at what's going on more generally in terms of the links between Gaza and the wider world in terms of armaments, at the same time we see these states in alliance with the US continue to supply Israel with the deadly weapon systems that are both used in Gaza, but also for wider regional wars. So that's why we call for a comprehensive arms embargo and the ending of the arms trade, which sees weapons from Israel sold as being battle tested against Palestinian populations bought by many Western states. At the same time, we've seen a huge escalation of Israel's oppressive occupation in the West Bank, where Palestinians face mass forced displacement, a surge in airstrikes, the first deployment of tanks in decades, and a sharp rise in attacks on children and other civilians. That's seen B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights organisation, call this process the Gazification of Israel's occupation of the West Bank. And the killing there isn't just at a greater rate than at any time since the Second Intifada began more than 20 years ago, but the displacement of whole populations have been greater than at any time since Israel's illegal occupation began in 1967. The Israeli military occupation in January effectively emptied 3 of the main refugee camps in the northern West Bank, in Jenin, Tulkarem and Nul Shams, displacing over 40,000 Palestinians. And looking at those wider regional consequences in the immediate proximity of Israel, we shouldn't forget that Israel now occupies a further area of Syria beyond the existing occupation of the Golan Heights, claiming to hold a 15-kilometre zone of control with an aspiration to stay there for the long term and dominate a further 60 kilometres deeper into Syria as a self-declared sphere of influence, but regularly conducting airstrikes and military raids across Syria. It's only now 2 days since Israel's last bombardment of Beirut, and of course we've seen frequent either Israeli or US airstrikes continue to attack Yemen, including through its civilian infrastructure. So whilst there is correctly an overwhelming focus on Gaza and the deaths that we're seeing there day in, day out, we should not ignore Israel's wider war on many fronts, which of course includes Iran. So Netanyahu, there is no secret that for decades he's harboured plans for a large-scale attack on Iran to either neutralise it militarily or to explicitly topple the Iranian state and find some kind of alternative which is much more amenable to Israeli demands right across the region. And I don't think anyone here would underestimate quite how perilous it was when we saw the long-term Israeli war of sabotage against Iran turned into an open conflict with bombings, assassinations, and then multiple rounds of airstrikes and missile and drone attacks being sent in both directions last year. And of course, this was in the context of Biden being US president at the time, and whilst deeply complicit in Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people, not least for electoral reasons. He did not favour an even wider regional war. Now, what would happen again if we resume that kind of scenario with a Trump presidency, especially if Netanyahu can convince him that after the experiences of last year, to claim that this is potentially some kind of easy win for Israel with a limited wider military response or paramilitary response from Tehran. Who knows what will happen? And of course, all of this is in the context of the disgraceful lack of consequences and accountability in relation to Gaza, in terms of sanctions, in terms of the support for the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice actions from many of the leading Western states. All of this obviously further undermines trust in those international legal systems and reinforces that a might is right approach can pay dividends. So the further tragedy of this situation is that the impunity or perceived impunity, both militarily and diplomatically, leads not to some kind of increased stability, but an increased risk of war. And in the case of Israeli-Iranian relations, one with potentially far more wide-ranging consequences than even the devastation that we've seen over the last 2 years. So as the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, in addition to our most urgent demands for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and for the ending of the blockade of food, medicines and power going into Gaza, we also support the absolutely vital goal of a wider nuclear-free, weapons-free zone across the Middle East. That needs Israel's existing nuclear program to be made available for IAEA inspection. We support all peaceful efforts to prevent any further nuclear proliferation in the region, and of course call for Israel's denuclearization and ultimately its accession into the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state. So I think we have a very large amount of work across many areas. We really hope to see a success of this NPT PrepCom leading towards something where a nuclear weapons free zone remains very high on the agenda, and something that we hope that many state parties as well as civil society will continue to push for throughout this process. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. And as you say, you know, this perception of impunity is massively kind of destabilizing, you know, globally, the situation, not just across the Middle East. So how important it is to sort of reassert the right of countries to sort of be, you know, following international law and international arms control frameworks. So thank you so much. I'm next really delighted to introduce our next speaker, Mark Curtis. Mark is the co-director of Declassified, a really absolutely essential public service journalism outlet that investigates UK foreign, military and intelligence policies. So really delighted to have you with us here, Mark. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Sophie, for those kind words. Yeah, I really appreciate it, and you know, I really welcome coming here today because this is an important topic, no doubt. It's very important to address nuclear arms issues in the Middle East because it's clearly such a dangerous time in the region and therefore globally. And we at Declassified have been trying to expose what UK government policy is towards the war and genocide in Gaza and the extent of Whitehall's support of Israel. And that's really what I wanted to sort of focus on now. As you mentioned, Sophie, the estimate is that Israel has around 90 nuclear weapons, but SIPRI, the Swedish Research Institute, estimates that it could be as much as 300 nuclear arms in possession of Israel. And SIPRI also says that Israel is believed to be modernizing its nuclear arsenal and upgrading its plutonium production reactor site at Dimona in the Negev desert. And that SIPRI assesses that Israel has around 10 cruise missile warheads for Israel's submarine fleet. Now, Israel also has land and air-based nuclear arms, it is believed, but I wanted to particularly mention the submarine-based nuclear arms because Britain has long provided components for Israeli submarines, in effect supporting the weapons platform and thus really supporting Israel's nuclear arms. In fact, British ministers of all governments have authorized 77 export licenses to supply Israel with components for submarines since 2010. And 2 of those export licenses are for open rather than single, meaning that unlimited quantities and values of that equipment can be provided to Israel from Britain. And it's believed that Israel has cruise missiles with a range of around 1,500 miles and can reach Iran with warheads weighing up to 200 kilograms. And Israel has recently unveiled its 6th and largest submarine last year in Germany, where it was built. And the Germans are about this year to deliver that new submarine to Israel. But there's a long history of Britain aiding Israel's nuclear arms in all sorts of various ways. I mean, Britain enabled Israel to acquire nuclear arms in the first place. In the 1950s, the UK sold Israel 20 tons of heavy water, which is a vital ingredient in the production of plutonium, again for the Dimona site, then in its relatively early days. And we had found a couple of years ago, we found declassified files showing that staff in the British Foreign Office and in the Ministry of Defence have actually known for over 40 years that Israel has developed nuclear arms. So there's a file from 1983 and marked secret in those files, showing the MOD believed Israel, quote, probably produces enough plutonium for 1 nuclear weapon per year, and that it may now have a stock of about 20, having gone into production in 1964. So that was in 1983. So that's over 40 years ago that Britain knew that Israel was producing these weapons. And by 1993, one UK official wrote, according to the declassified files, that the Israelis were probably the world's greatest proliferators when it came to nuclear-related technology. And in fact, that official that wrote that file was Simon Fraser, who went on to run the Foreign Office as its permanent secretary. So, I mean, ever since then until now, the British government position has been to protect Israel by refusing to acknowledge the open secret that Israel actually does possess nuclear weapons. And I think that's one of the key ways that Whitehall supports Israel internationally. So whenever the British government is asked about that in Parliament, the stock answer is that, quote, Israel has never declared a nuclear weapons program. That's always the response by governments. And then the British refuse to speculate on how many nuclear arms it might possess, which is plainly what it actually knows and has known about for a very long time. And then in the broader context of things, I think you get the sheer kind of imperialist arrogance of it. For example, a couple of weeks ago, General Nick Carter, the former head of the British Army, who now actually, now that he's left his post, now advises Israeli arms firms, which is probably a bit of scandal in itself. But Nick Carter pondered in a recent interview, is this the moment where you could end Iran's aspirations by a nuclear weapon through military action? He said that in an interview. Now, the idea that it might be okay to bomb Iran to prevent it acquiring nuclear weapons is actually perfectly acceptable in Whitehall. And in fact, I would say across the UK media, because these things are regularly speculated on. And the UK government repeatedly says, whenever it's asked in Parliament about Iranian plans to develop nuclear weapons, that Iran must never develop a nuclear weapon. That's a stock response by ministers. But of course, Britain is perfectly happy, in effect, with Israel's possession of nuclear arms. And I think that this sort of de facto British support for the Israeli nuclear program is, well, it's yet another example of Britain breaking an international commitment. I mean, the UK government was a sponsor of the landmark 1995 UN General Assembly resolution that called for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. The UK was a sponsor of that, so it played a key role in it. At the time, it knew Israel possessed nuclear weapons, and it didn't do anything about it then, and it doesn't do anything about it now. We know that just after the latest phase of the war broke out in October 2023, an Israeli government minister actually called for Israel to nuke Gaza. I mean, he was rebuked by Netanyahu, the prime minister. But these things are occasionally being spoken about in Israel, and who knows how far Israeli ministers will go in attacking Iran. And if Iran was attacked further, if Israel was attacked further, would Israel resort to using nuclear weapons? We don't know the answers to these questions. But in the UK, are there any red lines in Whitehall for what ministers would be happy for Israel to do? Well, the last 18 months of genocide suggest there really aren't very many, if any, red lines on what Britain is prepared to tolerate Israel to do. So I think a key task of us is to keep up the pressure on the British government to rebuke Israel and to challenge Israel, to begin to challenge Israel over its possession of nuclear weapons, to live up to its pledges, to its original pledge going back over 30 years for this nuclear weapons-free zone. And it's very important what we do here in the UK, because the UK is such a key ally of Israel. I mean, it sends a clear signal. If we could detach the UK government from its support for Israel, it would make a big difference internationally. That's very hard to do because there's such influence that the Israeli foreign policy establishment has over UK foreign policy making. So it's not easy, but I think public pressure, continued deepened public pressure, events like this, supporting CND, these sorts of things are exactly the sort of thing that we do need to help bring this pressure on the UK, to bring pressure on Israel, and then to bring about that nuclear weapons-free zone. Maybe I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. And as you rightly point out, the terrible sort of nuclear hypocrisy that exists, certainly in relation to Britain's attitude towards Israel and then towards Iran. But also, as you say, the fact that Britain was a key sort of sponsor of the UN resolution. And so, that's a good way for us to be kind of putting the pressure on. So thanks very much. Thanks to those who've put questions into the Q&A. Do put questions in. We've got a fantastic panel, so it's a great opportunity to hear their views. Okay, I'm now going to move on to our next speaker, Carol Turner. Carol Turner is a vice chair of CND. She's also convener of our international advisory group, and she's also an author. So great to have you with us, Carol. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. We've heard from both Ben and Mark about the Israeli hypocrisy and the support that Britain offers to that. I want to have a look at why it's essential that Iran cooperates and supports any practical steps whatsoever to move towards the denuclearization of the Middle East. So I want to try and explain that in the short time I have in the context of the talks that are taking place. Becoming a nuclear power not only means the ability to make nuclear bombs, it also means the ability to deliver them. Iran's the only country in the Middle East capable of acquiring a nuclear arsenal, an operational nuclear arsenal in the foreseeable future. And as we know, talks between Iran and the US have opened. There have been some developments in the past couple of weeks, although they've tended to be pushed out of Western news by President Trump's tariff war, developments in Ukraine, etc. I'm sure everyone on this call can recall the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated by President Obama over 2 years, which came into effect with the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 that was adopted on the 18th of October 2015. This was, in CND's opinion, one of the most important arms limitation agreements of recent times. But given the North American and European media lack of coverage, you'll be forgiven for not knowing that the JCPOA actually remains in force until 18th of October this year, formally speaking, if not in practice. Under the Obama deal, in return for lifting some international sanctions, Iran agreed to restrict uranium enrichment, limit the number and types of centrifuges, sorry, I can't pronounce that, in operation, and that included discontinuing the use of heavy water reactors, which were able to produce weapons-grade plutonium as a byproduct. Iran also agreed to cut the size of its enriched uranium stockpiles and permit inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's watchdog. Regular IAEA inspections confirmed that the agreement was operating successfully. The reports were accepted by all the parties and internationally, including by official US bodies. Despite this, Trump unilaterally withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and has reimposed sanctions. This effectively killed the JCPOA. Britain, France, and Germany, the E3, whilst formally remaining parties to the UNSC motion, followed suit and imposed national sanctions. Okay, so let's turn to the current talks. What Trump wants has been in the public domain since the beginning of this year. Iran must give up its uranium enrichment program, relinquish its civil nuclear power program, cease to develop missile defenses, and forego relations with its co-thinkers in the region, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, etc. This represents a break with the bipartisan approach of Republican and Democratic presidents to date, and that's been to focus on preventing Iran's acquisitions of nuclear weapons without the linkage that Trump is demanding. Since returning to the White House, he's ratcheted up sanctions on Iran and suggested military strikes by Israel or even the US could target Iranian nuclear sites, as Mark mentioned in his contribution just now. There is, in fact, contradictory information about the degree to which Israeli strikes at the end of last year damaged Iran's nuclear facilities. So what's Iran's approach? Throughout the difficulties over the JCPOA, Iran has called for a return to the deal and has sought to continue talks. There is, however, broad concern that US withdrawal from the nuclear agreement has prompted hawks within the Iranian government to disregard constraints imposed by the JCPOA. It's reported that Iran is now closer to acquiring nuclear-grade uranium, though estimates vary wildly, from 5 years or more to a matter of weeks. I think we can probably disregard the latter. And in the past 18 months, there's been growing internal pressure from nuclear hawks in the political and clerical structures of Iran to acquire nuclear weapons in the belief, wrongly in CND's opinion, this will deter attacks. This pressure coincides with popular pressure for democratization of society, and opposition to the government is surfacing as a result of Iran's economic difficulties, a combination of sanctions and the domestic impact as the international cost of living rises. So it's against this background that a third round of talks took place last weekend, and it's been announced that the US and Iran have agreed to draw up a framework for further discussions. I want to highlight three contemporary developments. First, a few days before the meeting, Secretary of State Mark Rubio said that Iran could not be allowed to enrich uranium, only import it for its civil nuclear power program. That suggests that the US is bent on sticking to a tougher framework for a new agreement. Second, Washington has targeted Iranian exports of oil. Its intention is to reduce those exports to zero. And most recently, it's imposed sanctions on importers of Iranian liquefied petroleum gas. Last week, the spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry said that this showed, and I quote, lack of goodwill and seriousness about the talks. And I think both of those indicate that we're far from agreement at this stage. Thirdly and finally, I want to just briefly mention developments in relation to China and Russia. Iran, Russia and China met in March. They issued a joint statement which stressed a number of things. Iran's rights to civil nuclear power as a signatory to the NPT, upholding the NPT as a cornerstone of the international non-proliferation regime, support for UNSC Resolution 2231, the removal of unlawful unilateral sanctions on Iran, and restraint so as not to escalate the situation. In January, President Putin and his Iranian counterpart, Masoud Pezeshkian, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, signed a 20-year strategic partnership treaty ratified by the Russian Duma at the beginning of April. And that includes closer military and energy cooperation, and it includes working together on building civil nuclear power stations. So in the light of this, I think it's safe to conclude the following: that if the current talks fail, there will be pressure from Israel on the US for further military action against Iran, which the United States is sympathetic towards, and that pressure from within Iran for the development of a nuclear weapons program will continue and become greater. These, in CND's opinion, make talks even more decisive, both in terms of avoiding military escalation into a wider war across the Middle East in the immediate future, as well as the possibility for denuclearizing the region in the longer term. That's it for me. Thanks for listening to my presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Carol. That was incredibly helpful and, completely motivating the reasons why we're having this discussion and why this treaty is like so central. Okay, so just to say we've sort of had apologies, unfortunately, from Jeremy Corbyn, who's in Parliament today, and there's a debate on statement on Palestine, so he's wanting to participate in that. Was really hoping to be able to make the webinar, but unfortunately they clash, so apologies from him. But we're going to move on now to questions, so thank you very much to everybody who's put their questions into the Q&A. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of read through the questions, like all of them, and then speakers can decide which questions you'd like to answer which, speak to your sort of particular specialism. I mean, I think there's a couple where it's sort of to an actual particular speaker, but that's how I'm going to do it, if that's all right. And then when you come back and answer those questions, and also, if you include in that your sort of summary as well, that would be great. I hope that's all right. Okay, so we had a really good question from Anthony, saying, shouldn't we also be looking at the role of the US and Britain in terms of the implementation of this treaty? Then we've had a very specific question from Alfred saying, is Israel's nuclear waste processed at Sellafield? So a bit more in terms of the links with the British nuclear industry. Then we've had a couple of questions from Linda. So she's asking about the role of organisations like the Middle East Treaty Organisation in terms of helping denuclearise the Middle East. And she's also raised the issue with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the fact that non-nuclear weapon states within that treaty are allowed, as part of that treaty, to develop civilian nuclear power, and the fact that this kind of raises issues in terms of sort of the blurring of those technologies. So if people want to come in on that. Then there's a question for sort of Mark from John, sort of saying, in terms of sort of British foreign policy, the sort of is it sort of like Israel that's kind of, sort of got a hold over sort of British foreign policy, or is it the US, and obviously that's that question just particularly for Mark. So I hope that's all right for our speakers. I'm going to sort of take them in the order that you spoke in. That's okay. So I'm going to go to Ben first.
Yeah, so just pick up on a couple of those. So I think Linda's point is Linda's question is really good around the Middle East Treaty Organization and activists such as Sharon Dolev, activists from within Israel who are using the sort of available sort of legal or diplomatic pressures sort of like internally within Israel to try and campaign for at least more openness and honesty in the Israeli position, and obviously all the things that people will raise in other nuclear weapon states or even nuclear power states around sort of like more immediate safety, financial accountability, and other kinds of issues. And I think that kind of pressure from within and the links that we can make with the movement within Israel, albeit of, we should acknowledge, of very limited size and scope, sadly, where we can make those links and support activists supporting a nuclear-free Middle East within Israel. That's something very much to be encouraged and welcomed. In terms of the Sellafield question, I don't believe that there's ever been a shipment from Israel coming to the UK. However, we obviously know that, talking to the sort of like slightly wider issue around how does US-UK relations then interface with US-Israeli relations, and the sharing of all sorts of nuclear technologies between the US and UK, what then actually sort of like leaks out, not necessarily through nuclear materials, but through sort of like unacknowledged technology transfers or other things. I think these are interesting questions to be explored further. And yes, to acknowledge here, whilst we're talking about different state parties and different actors in the Middle East, and it's whilst obviously commendable that there are many of the NPT parties across the Middle East wishing to engage in this, the biggest, the overwhelming majority of what's going to come to pass here is going to be determined in Washington. So we shouldn't ignore the fact that the US administration has an absolutely huge and disproportionate impact on all these discussions. Yes, the historic development of Israel's nuclear weapons were a much greater arm's length from the US than say Britain's or other states, but where we are now in terms of Israel's nuclear posture, and also then its sort of like shield, its conventional military shield, expanding to the actions of both the US and then other NATO and allied states, Jordan and others, in the interactions with Iran last year. The direct inclusion of British RAF jets, American jets, a whole carrier strike groups and others being deployed into the region. Clearly all of that takes place with being marshalled by the US, so we should not in any way underestimate the impact that the US administration and its increasingly unpredictable whims can have in this area. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ben, and really great to have you on this webinar. Okay, over to you, Mark.
I was going to come on to the question that somebody asked about, is it Israel that has such a hold over UK foreign policy, or is it the US? And I think the answer to that is, it's a bit of both. I mean, I think that a major reason why the UK government over the decades has been so pro-Israel, it's been so supportive of Israel, whatever it's done, is because of the special relationship. I mean, it is known in Whitehall that upsetting the US over Israel is a kind of red line. And for the UK to exert a kind of an independent position on Israel would greatly upset Washington, and foreign policy planners know that. And I think that's probably the single biggest reason that explains the UK's own kind of special relationship with Israel, if you want to call it that. And I think sort of understanding that is quite important. But the other thing that's critical to understand is the strength of the Israel lobby in the UK, which I think also does heavily influence British policy towards Israel. I mean, we've done a lot of work at Declassified looking at the extent to which MPs and ministers have been funded by figures in the pro-Israel lobby, either individuals or groups like Conservative Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, and others. And there's no doubt that we found recently that a quarter of British MPs, this is just before the election last year, a quarter of British MPs have actually been funded by the pro-Israel lobby. So there's no doubt that must have quite a lot of influence over the minds of ministers and of MPs. I mean, if Russia was funding MPs and ministers to a tenth of that degree, it would be a national scandal, and you'd read about it in the papers every other day. But it's kind of just been passed over, the extent to which these pro-Israel figures, are able to fund our democratically elected representatives. And so I think that's a kind of scandal in itself. And of course, and in addition to that, is we don't know who funds Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel. I mean, if they are being funded by Israeli state institutions, for example, then that would be even more pernicious, because that means that the Israeli state would be directly funding, in effect, or directly or indirectly, depending on how you look at it, would be having an enormous influence over British policymaking, I think you could say. But we don't know. We don't know who's funding them. So that there is a real lack of clarity over the Israel lobby in the UK. I think the more that we can do to expose that, to reveal what that Israel lobby is doing, the better. Because I do think that the only way that we are going to be able to challenge, I think, the UK's extraordinary support for Israel, and it has been extraordinary throughout the genocide over the last 18 months. The spy flights, the military accord, the training that's been taking place in the UK. I mean, we at Declassified, we've been trying to find out about these 6 Israeli military officers who the government admitted were being trained in Britain in early 2024. Since then, the Labour government has refused to provide any details about who those officers are in the UK, where they are, what they're being trained on. Why aren't we allowed to know about that? And then there's the trade relationship that's going on. There's still negotiations going on towards a free trade agreement with Israel. Trade officials are going out to Israel regularly. And so we are a million miles away from anything like sanctions, and so I think that the pressure needs to be massively increased to make it more difficult for the UK to get away with its sort of pretty much unrelenting support for Israel. But I think that public pressure has actually already had some kind of impact. I think it has probably pulled Britain back from even greater support from Israel. I think it has sort of mitigated and kind of qualified some aspects of British support for Israel, which otherwise they would have wanted to have got away with, but find it harder to, knowing that there is massive opposition to the genocide. So I do think we can draw on some good positive impacts going forward. But there's no doubt that I think we need to keep exposing that the extent to which the UK supports Israel, the extent of the Israel lobby, which contributes to that. And I think, if we continue to do that, then I think we might be able to bring about more changes in British foreign policy.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. Okay, so to our final speaker, Carol.
Thanks, Sophie. I'd like to make 3 points, if I may. The first, about British hypocrisy. The second, to add an element into the situation in the Middle East, which other speakers haven't mentioned and I didn't have time in my contribution. And thirdly, a comment on the NPT itself and the process. So I think it's pretty clear from all sides the hypocrisy of the UK government in relation to its complicity in what's happening in Israel and Gaza. There are other elements of hypocrisy which back this up. We know that the supposedly independent Trident nuclear weapons system in Britain is not independent at all. It's dependent on America supplying the wherewithal for us to use that. And we know that as a result of that, Britain is tied into the NATO military structure. And we also now know, and the population in Britain are beginning to know more about this, that as a result of that, US nuclear weapons are likely to return to British soil. And that's why CND had a protest at Lakenheath at the weekend, which hopefully Sophie might have a moment to comment on before the seminar ends. The relationship between Britain and America rests on the Mutual Defence Agreement, which Keir Starmer has now made permanent rather than something treaty that has to be renewed. And it's totally dependent on cooperation on nuclear weapons. That's the background, and that's more about British hypocrisy, which in my opinion reveals why some of the things that Ben and Mark are saying are taking place. The second point I'd like to make is this is in relationship to Iran and the Middle East, is the role of the Gulf states, which I don't think is entirely clear at this moment in time, which I think is very important. The importance of the Gulf states is demonstrated, for instance, in the fact that Oman facilitated the first round of the talks that are currently taking place, and the Gulf states continue to be involved. Since the Abraham Accords were negotiated during Trump's first term in office, with the purpose of normalizing relations between Israel and the Gulf states. The rift amongst members of the Gulf Cooperation Council has healed, and the Gulf states have made friendly overtures towards regional neighbours, including Iran, which are relatively unknown, relatively unheard of. The head of the Saudi military, for example, and this is most unusual, made a visit to Tehran last autumn after Trump's victory, and Iran later praised Saudi support for the Palestinians. Now, that's an interesting development. I certainly don't have enough depth of knowledge of what's going on there to sort of comment with great assurance, but I think what it does indicate is that a certain reorganization of relations in the region, which might give us more room to hope that we can have some sort of talk, some sort of moves towards a nuclear-free Middle East in the future. It's clearly not on the agenda in the immediate situation. And the final comment is on the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself. There are three elements to it. I'm sure everyone on the call is as aware of this as I am. The first is that the signatory states, the non-nuclear weapons signatory states, in return for agreeing not to develop nuclear weapons, are allowed access to civil nuclear power. That applies to Iran and has applied to Iran throughout the JCPOA and before that. But the nuclear weapons possessing states that are part of the NPT agree to reduce the nuclear weapons that they have, which I think we would all agree at the very least is taking place at too slow a rhythm. And there are many examples that will cause us to think that in fact it's not taking place at all. That's a bit beyond the scope of this discussion, but I'm talking about the development of so-called mini nukes, which of course are not mini at all, and plans and developments for further missile defences. And the third element of the NPT is that in return for this, the watchdog of the UN will inspect to make sure that the treaty is being upheld. Now, there are many critics of the NPT, and there are even more people who express concern about its operation, that in effect, the nuclear weapons states are rather let off the hook, whilst the focus is on the prevention of proliferation by non-nuclear weapons states. And although I'm sure all of us on this call would agree that that is a good thing, we would also be aware that in order for it to proceed effectively, you actually have to have a certain equality and justice in the way the NPT is operated. I think that's probably enough from me. Sophie, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much to all of our speakers, and I hope that they've answered as fully as possible the questions. Thanks so much to everybody for joining this webinar and for participating. Certainly, if people have said there's a huge amount of work to do, like huge challenges that we face, but it's public protest and it is like public pressure that is what has sort of historically stopped politicians and pulled them back from the nuclear brink. And we have to remember that our role in this is absolutely critical, and and our movement is having a big impact. I mean, certainly, we want to be doing absolutely everything possible, putting massive pressure on both Israel and the US to attend the conference in November around, a weapons of mass destruction free treaty. Also, we want to be pushing for the extension of the JCPOA. It's really important that we support that and that that's extended. But also we are going to continue to, push for peace in the Middle East and for the end of this genocidal war against the Palestinian people, because, part of the reason why CND campaigns against war is because, it's nuclear weapons get used in war. They don't get used in the abstract. So it's absolutely critical that we continue to keep the pressure up to implement a ceasefire and to bring sort of real justice for the Palestinian people. And so I'd really urge everybody to participate in the 77th anniversary NACMA demonstrations, which are taking place on the 17th of May. Is going to be a big national demonstration in London, but these will be happening, all across the world. So I really, really encourage people to participate in that as well. So thanks again. Let's keep up the pressure and see you all soon on the next demonstrations. All the best.